So it is good to be with you this morning. My name is Malia, and I am living in St. Louis with my little Kanaka family. We are Jew-Hawaiian. My dad is a Jew from the Bronx, and my mom is a Hawaiian, and our roots are on Molokai and Maui. And so one of the most powerful things that happens for me whenever I have an opportunity to come and work on the islands is to bring my kids here. And what's so incredible is what we will be talking about today is how to really deeply support the well-being and well-becoming of our kids and what it looks like to implement the art and science of caring for kids. And I see that so deeply on display when I get to have them here, immersed in their culture and their language and with family and with even just the foods that we eat in the regular grocery store. So today we're going to be on a journey really thinking about how kids have changed in such complex times, what it means for the work that we do, what it means for them, how it has changed their brains and their bodies, and what we can do to best support their thriving. For me, thriving is about making sure our kids are ready for the world as it is, a world that is often unfair and unjust, and always uncertain and volatile. And also that we can care for them well and they can feel that they are cared for. Sometimes that's the same and sometimes that's different. Brevity is not my strength, so I have set an alarm. I promise you that we will work hard to get you out in time. And I hope that if you have interest in the books that we'll be drawing from, that you will then follow me to a room across the hall where the bookstore is selling copies of those books. But first, a little bit about me. You know, when you talk about things like well-being and thriving and human development, or when you hear a speaker, I think it's really important to check their credibility, both in terms of a sensitivity to context, because context matters so deeply, and also to make sure they actually know what they're talking about. So my background starts on the front lines of education. I was a pre-K teacher, then a fifth grade teacher, a middle school coach. I ran a high school for youth who had dropped out, who wanted to return and finish on a technical college campus. It was the first and only competency-based school in the state of Missouri, so I was deeply involved in the local work and in changing state policy. And then for the last 10 years, I've been working at the national and global level, really thinking deeply about the difference between what it means to complete high school and graduate and what it actually takes to be ready for what comes next, because it just isn't always the same thing. And so I've been in pursuit of this question personally and professionally, actually since I left school myself, which was after the 8th grade. So I'm a GED recipient, a very strange back origin story for talking to you at a school and education conference. But today I talk about my work as being schoolhouse to the White House, so I'm always working with individual schools. I feel like if you're going to work nationally, you must have a foot deeply anchored on the front lines in the lives of kids and the adults who are working with them every single day. And I do work at the national level in federal policy issues with folks like the White House and national networks. One of the important things about my background that I hope will be helpful as we're talking is that I've spent as much time in K-12 and youth development as I have in higher education and workforce development. So I have both an understanding of what we need to do to support young people in childhood and the tween and teen years, as I do in having a deep understanding of the future of work, the changing workforce, the changing world of post-secondary education. It's a really interesting thing because so often our picture of what it means to be college and career ready is actually based on a pretty outdated picture of what adulthood actually requires today. Most importantly, before we go any farther, I want to just claim my space of integrity, which is I'm a mom of 2 school-age kids, And you'll see in a couple moments also two godchildren who live with me in the summer. Together, they straddle elementary, middle, and high school. And so I promise you that everything we talk about today, I'm doing with the precision of a scholar, with the practice of a practitioner, but with the heart of a mom. I think that our kids are living in deeply complex times, and it has changed them at a fundamental, even a cellular level. And that it's critically important that we come in the door of their wholeness and well-being, and that the gift of that is what we'll see in a moment. It actually supports their learning and development as well. So as I mentioned when we got started, I will be drawing from two books in this conversation, and they're both going to be available at the bookstore. But one of them, Whole Child, Whole Life, was written while being deeply involved with a number of schools across Hawaii. So the entire Molokai complex, or that part of the complex, is reading and using this book. My work with them is deeply informed by the book. For any of you who have been invested in and implementing HA, the HA framework is really held up and deeply prioritized in a chapter on culture and identity development. But I would say both of these books are sort of meant to be companions to each other, and you'll see that in the presentation. Making It was written first, and that is, do you need me to move? Am I in the wrong spot? Okay. That is, what do young people need to be ready in this crazy changing world? And it came out in the middle of the pandemic, when all of our households were homeschools and everything was shut down. And whenever I would go out and talk about what kids need to be ready for the future, someone would inevitably say, yeah, but the kids are not okay right now. What do they need now? What do they need to be well? And so this book addresses that. So where I can, I'll try to go deep, but you can't go very deep in such a short period of time. So I just want to name that these books were written as references for you. They were also written for any person who works with and raises kids, because we all have a collective job to do. And so often we in education only get books about educating kids, and parents only get books about parenting kids, and there's not sort of a space in between to say, oh, we're all responsible for the collective care of these children. Come on in, you're right on time. Just take a seat wherever. So I'm going to start with a quote that comes from Whole Child, Whole Life. And I wish that my son was here. Whole Child, Whole Life, this book about caring for children in such complex times, starts with the voice of a child, because a book about kids should. And it starts with my son, Justice Hi'ilani's voice. But he's not here, and so you're stuck with mine. This is a challenging time to be young. Kids are growing up amid pandemics and other health scares, economic crises, extreme weather, divided politics, violence, extremism, and more. Global problems are personal and proximate. Fear for the future and worry for the present is palpable. Young people must keep living and learning during historic firsts, at times when we are struggling to cope ourselves. The last time I was in Hawaii, I was on Molokai, and I woke up in the morning and I was supposed to fly to Maui, and there was no power. And I walked to the lanai, and I could see Maui on fire. And I flew here instead. And we all remember what we were doing that day and those days. And I went to Nanakuli Elementary. They bought me Subway, and they set up a little office in the conference room. And we all sat together. And even though it had felt before like there was some distance between the pandemic and where we were, in that moment when the wildfires hit, it was like this compressor. And all we could talk about was, God, these kids just got through the pandemic. Today's kids, our kids, your students, are living in a continuous onslaught of catastrophic conditions. And the way that I think about it is like volume dials: extreme weather, health scares, political volatility, violence, technological change. And in any moment, a dial can turn from low to loud. And it can happen so fast. And so our job then is to begin to confront and address what it means to educate and raise and collectively care for a group of kids who have only known life in the constancy of crisis or the possibility of crisis. So these are my kids. My two godkids are on the ends, as you might guess. And my two babies, Koa and Justice Hi'ilani, are in the middle. I want to tell you about them for a moment. And there's one piece of information I'm going to share that's going to feel tough. Well, I think it will feel tough for us. And then talk about why it's so exciting and critical to center well-being in the work that we do. So these four have, like all kids, struggled through tremendous stress and trauma in the pandemic. One of our jobs is to prepare kids for this kind of growing up experience and how it will follow in adulthood. But another part of our job is protecting their ability to just be kids. So Koa, the little one, he was only in first grade when the pandemic hit. He's in his last year of elementary school and has just experienced his very first field trip ever. Because that much was missed. Even when they went back initially, that much was missed. These quintessential moments. He only knows life as a COVID kid. It has defined the entirety of elementary school. And it shows up when he gets sick, when a birthday party comes up, when a moment or a milestone. He lives with this undercurrent of, well, when is it going to just fall apart? When is it going to get scary again? Justice, his brother, is in 7th grade, and in the middle of the pandemic experienced a tremendously scary mental health challenge that ended up being brought on by an untreated strep infection. And we had no idea what was going on. Justice is not alone in that. For those of you who haven't been following this part of the news, the rates of depression, anxiety, OCD, and similar disorders or symptoms are up between 700 and 900% in kids. Now, you could say that that's because kids are talking about this more, but that does not help us understand that level of rise. And so we'll look at what that means. So here comes the tough piece. The young man on the far left, Brian, my godson, who I raised when he was little, and he still lives with us most summers. I was at a meeting in Virginia last October. Now, he is alive and well. I want to start with that. So just a little over a year ago, I got one of these double phone calls from my husband. I don't know if you're partnered or married, if you have a rule like this in your house, but like if you call once, you can ignore it in my family. But if you do the double, then something's going on. So I looked at my phone and I had 3 missed calls and 2 missed text messages. And the one that had just come in said, "Don't go on social media, call me." And it was my husband. And I knew there had been a school shooting. I didn't know who, but I knew someone. So Brian had a shooter, an alumni of the school, had come into the building, his high school, with 600 rounds of ammunition. And Brian ended up being shot through his hands and his face. He had to jump out of a 2-story building to survive. How he survived, none of us know. And the next day, I kept my kids home, and I had to fly home, obviously, went straight to the hospital. But eventually, I had to send my kids back to school, and Brian and his sister Chloe had to go back to school without any promise or guarantee that they would be safe. And so here's the tension. This is a conversation about thriving, and I am talking about trauma. Where and how do we navigate the tension in between? Our kids deserve for us to take an honest look at the realities that are the lives that they are living and that they are looking into in the future. And they also deserve for us to figure out and pursue every single thing that can support their well-being even when and even if. And so the good news for us, in whatever role you hold, whether it is in school, out of school, whether you are coming and you're like, oh, well, this is about my students and my own kids. I'm parenting too. We have to do, as the grown-ups, a little bit of grief work, because the realities of being a kid today are a little bit rough. And then we have to go about the work of figuring out when and where and how flourishing can still happen. And the incredible thing is, when we come in the door of well-being, and we'll look at what it looks like, it actually lights up the conditions of health and healing and learning and development. When we are relational, when we are supporting belonging, when we are cultivating spaces for service and spirituality, when we are attending to mental and physical health, kids can not only be healthy and whole, but they can heal and they can learn much, much better. I help support the strategy work for a national alliance on the science of learning and development, the best scholars we have across the globe and in the continental US on the science of learning. And I am telling you, what we'll talk about today is not reserved for student support services, although it should live there. It is also about the very best pedagogy and practice we have. And so where that starts is making sure we can get a truly holistic picture of who kids are. In education, when we talk about whole child, maybe a little less in Hawaii, but overwhelmingly, we are only talking about the kid. And the thing is that kids are not cogs. They live in context and community and family. For us to be able to support them in whatever role you have, we have to find big ways of getting to know the whole of who they are, individually or collectively, if you are in charge of a group or a school or a district, a youth program or a network. We have to understand who they are in relationship to other people and the other spaces in their lives. So we're going to do a very cursory look, which is very deeply detailed in Whole Child, Whole Life, on how to get to know truly the whole child. And so where it starts, and hopefully my little PSA at the beginning, some of you came in late and I was like, this is the smallest font, make sure you can see it. So make sure you can see this. So the way that we start naturally, instinctively developing a whole child portrait is actually a pretty harmful and basic way, which is, what do we know or think we know about this kid or these kids based on how they look and how they live? And the importance of that is that that profiling, that basic beginning picture, reveals to us the kinds of vulnerabilities and opportunities that they will have. Because it tells us, based on how you look and how you live, how will you experience the world and how will the world experience you? Demographics, things like race and ethnicity and gender and sexual orientation. They change sometimes, but not often. They have a different impact in different places. What it means to look Hawaiian in Hawaii or in a part of Hawaii on the west side is going to be different from on the continent, is going to be different from some other place in Australia or New Zealand. So we have to think about, what does it mean to look like you look, to live like you live in the context that I am seeing and experiencing you, and in the context that you are experiencing life. The important thing for us as educators is if there are particular ways of living or ways of looking that we are unfamiliar with, we have an ethical and moral obligation to be learners, to actively pursue the learning of those identities and ways of living and ways of looking. The second part of getting to know the whole of who a kid is to get a picture of where they are developmentally. Now, most of you will have a good sense of that, but I want to share an important insight of what we've been seeing since the pandemic. And hopefully this will clarify what perhaps you've been feeling with your own students. Because human development is so social, kids hit developmental milestones based on social experiences that they're having. We're just social beings. When the pandemic slowed or stopped those social experiences, it jacked up development. So what we're seeing is that kids are growing up fast and slow. The past few years, environmentally, health-wise, economically, all of the big forces, has aged them prematurely. And when I look at the gray hair that I don't want to have yet, I think it's aged me too, prematurely. I'd like to hope so. And it's not just, anyway, I digress. But it has aged kids quickly. They have been exposed to really adult things. But because the social experiences got messed up, it has staged them slowly. So you end up with 9th graders who act like 7th graders who use language of 30-year-olds, right? You end up with 5th graders who act like 2nd graders who are talking about sleigh and this and that and all of the things that they are watching on YouTube, an unregulated space where they're still trying to get all of the social experiences that they need. If you have not gotten yourself educated on the full range of developmental milestones, it is time. It is time, because today's 9th graders are not your past 9th graders. But here's the other thing that's really important about this. Today's 9th graders might be acting like 7th graders. But in 5 years, you're going to get a group of 9th graders, and during the pandemic, they missed early childhood. Each grade missed a different portion of developmental experience. And so we have to just acknowledge with a deep sigh the exhaustion of that, but we are responsible for these children. And these children did not choose to have 2-3 years of their lives so deeply messed up. And we talk about learning loss, but we do not talk about the developmental mix-up that happened as a result of not only the 2 years, but then the deep structuring to keep them physically safe, but also so distant when they came back. The next part of getting to know a child is their health. So I have a question for you. If you are a nurse or healthcare professional, I want you to recuse yourself from this question. Can you raise your hand if you have ever taken a class in pediatric and adolescent health? Okay, look around. Can you raise your hand if you have ever had a student or child in your life who had some sort of health issue or complexity or need. Why the hell don't we take a class in pediatric and adolescent health? When kids get sick, when they get injured, when they experience inflammation because they're sick now, or even generationally that can cause chronic inflammation. None of us. I have a graduate degree from a top institution in education and a top institution in social work. And never did I ever get training on what happens when a kid is iron deficient or vitamin D deficient or anemic, well, that's iron deficient, or in need of sleep, or the impact of food. We need that. Those first three pieces help us care for a kid, but they don't necessarily help a kid feel cared for. Because we could know all the things about their basic sort of, here's their file, here are the health issues, here's the developmental sort of tracker, here's where they are demographically, here's how they live, how they look. For kids to feel cared for, we need the other two pieces. First, we have to become cartographers of their lives. We need to know their people. We need to know where they spend time, what those places look like. The way that I think about this is my little one, Koa, is in 5th grade. Miss Dawson is his teacher. And if he ran into her classroom and was like, Miss Dawson, I need to tell you what happened this weekend. And she looked at him with all the love and professionalism she could muster, and she said, well, Harrison, she actually calls him Koa, but his first name is Harrison. Well, Harrison, you're just a student. We only talk about school here. It would crush his little heart. Because in the eyes of a kid, she is a major adult in his life. And dear God, I drop Koa off at 8 a.m. in the morning, and then he goes to after school. I don't pick him up from school until 6 p.m. Me, as the mom, I would be an idiot to say, these adults aren't raising my child. Those adults are raising my child. And they deserve the respect of that, but also I need them to know him. And I need them to do things that allow him to feel cared for. And knowing their world is something that we often do when we have time, but when we are stressed and stretched, we shove it aside. Because who has time for that? And we need to make time for it. And the last part is what I think about as like the alchemy, the magic and mystery of working with kids, which is how do you get to a place where you know what their strengths and struggles are so much that when Koa walks into the room, Miss Dawson can say, honey, you okay? Something looks off, right? Like, or, oh, what happened? You're beaming. It's that part. It's that sort of spirit of the work. We cannot put practices in place unless we actually know the who of the who our kids are. And again, to keep it really practical and concrete, there are big ways that we can do that. If you are in the classroom right now, or if you're supporting teachers, how do we do conferences? How do we do check-ins? How do we do with little ones, morning meetings with older ones, advisory? But then there's the everyday. And if you are raising children, our children are constantly evolving, and we have got to do that with them as well. So our portrait of a whole child is complete when we take our working knowledge of who kids are, where they come from, how they are doing, and the stage of life they're in, and blend those features with an authentic understanding of their real-time strengths and struggles. I want to give you the quickest look, especially because we started a couple minutes late, of the historic context that we're situating all of this in. So we get to know the whole of a kid, and we talked about the sort of catastrophic conditions or crises. The historic look here is that we are 20 years into this. So our look back to the future here is that for our young adults who have just exited the K-12 system, they began life right after 9/11. They started kindergarten in the middle of the Great Recession. They were finishing high school when the world shut down, and they're launching in the middle of this moment of extreme weather, economic hardship, political division, uncertainty, and a mental health crisis. In case I don't get to it later, here's something that I need you to know about that. That's the whole of our young people who have just exited K-12, which means that every kid who is younger than that, this is all that they know. And it has wired and rewired their brains because we are wired and rewired based on the environments we're in and the experiences we have. So take a moment here. So this content comes from Making It to look at the headings of what that has done. And you probably will find yourself in here also. Our kids often are coming to us in a state of overwhelm, overload, stress, distraction. They want safety and predictability so badly, but they also don't really know how to handle it. It makes them squirm a little bit. And for any kid who was already having a tough time, all of those like ageless issues, addiction, divorce, abuse, neglect, well, all of that is still there on top of this sort of other layer. And so what that means for the work of caring for kids and preparing kids is that in order to get them to a place where learning can happen, we have to balance and manage and reduce. And here's why. I often feel this way too. But when it comes to young people, they've actually moved how long adolescence lasts. So if you don't know, adolescence now lasts from the onset of puberty, earlier and earlier every year, like 10, 11, until about 25. And the reason why they pushed adolescence, the range up into those years, is because we now know more about how the front of the brain works. This is crucially important for any of you who are still working with kids every day. The front of the brain is under construction until the mid-20s, right? About 26. The front of the brain is responsible for all of your executive functioning skills, which includes things like being able to focus, be organized, regulate your emotions, make good decisions, problem solve, think creatively, think critically. So those are all the things that we often consider the behavior and the traits of a good, well-behaved student. Well, not only is that whole part of our brain under construction when we are in elementary, middle, and high school, but anytime young people experience stress, trauma, overwhelm, overload, any of these pieces, it pulls the energy away from the front of the brain and puts it in the back being responsible for surviving. What we often see as problematic behaviors is actually the brain doing what it can to survive. And kids are not alone in that. The art of this work is doing what is best for kids and having it also be good for us. It is the everyday actions that contribute to our collective well-being and to nurturing relationships, environments, and experiences that enrich everyone in them. So we get to consider the whole of who a kid is, and we consider the historic context and how it is changing them at a neurological, a biological level. And so the question is then, well, how do we support them? And so I want to just kind of name one thing, like breaking away from talking to you to say, like, we are only going to, oh, that's like a really big sound. Do you guys hear that? Okay, I'm gonna not sing, but we're gonna have some music in the background. It feels very dramatic. We have to understand context to understand kids, and that context includes how they are situated individually, how they are situated in family and in community, and how they are situated in history and society. It's a whole ecology of supporting young people. These practices are incredible because it is the science of flourishing, thriving, longevity, learning, development, all of the things, resiliency. And it is the same set of practices that support health and wholeness for kids as for adults. So we often talk about creating lifelong learners. I think the opportunity that we have is to create a culture that supports lifelong thriving. These are the practices that when I showed the picture of Justice and Koa and Brian and Chloe and talked about when we come in the door of well-being, we turn on the lights of learning and development and health and healing. It's these. So these practices work for every age and stage to support wholeness, well-being, thriving of kids. And they break into different groups. So if any of you know Ka'anoi at the Department of Ed, she's in the Office of Hawaiian Education, she has talked about how this is, that's my 5 minutes. We're gonna be great. Listen, we started almost 15 minutes late. So we're gonna get you out kind of on time. We're gonna go for, can we go for 8 more minutes? Yeah? Okay, we're going for 8-ish minutes. Yeah, we got this, no problem. It's only all of the things you need to do to support the health and well-being of kids. Buy the book. That's, what a great, follow me to the bookstore, learn more. Okay, so Ka'anoi calls this the breath work of well-being. So if you're familiar with the Ha framework, this is its own breath work. So the first set of practices that support thriving across the whole life and also learning and development are these foundational practices. It is basic needs, mental health, and interests. And here's why. Young people, of course, need their basic needs met. But what is incredible about kids and their basic needs is that in addition to the essentials, housing, food, we as humans also have the need to feel loved and like we belong. But kids have 2 basic needs that we don't: play and rest. And often we don't have opportunities to create spaces for them to play and to rest, to recharge. Mental health, obviously, as an incredible need. In the book, I talk a lot about mental health first aid and also all the different symptoms and signs that we need to be looking at. But it's this kind of confluence of how do we support young people, not only if mental health challenges come up, but in moments of grief and loss and trauma. The big takeaway here for my 8-ish minutes, now 8-ish minutes still, is this. It's not a matter of if a kid is going to have a mental health challenge. It's a matter of when. We have to assume every single child in our life that we are working with or raising is going to have their mental health challenged at some point, probably seriously, which means we must cross-train ourselves. As educators, we have to get trained in first aid and CPR and AED training, but we don't have to get trained in mental health first aid. If you care about kids, you need to train yourself in mental health first aid. What are the emotional wound care strategies that you can do? What do you do when you see certain signs or symptoms? How do you apply that kind of triage? There are not enough mental health providers to support the number of kids who are having challenges. It is an all hands on deck deal. And the reason why interests is a foundational skill is because novelty is a basic need. If kids don't have spark, they're not fully alive. The next set of practices, we're doing great, guys, is an exhale. It's social. And that is the importance of relationships and community, and also being identity-safe places that offer culturally nourishing experiences. The big takeaways here, again, for time's sake, is that the research is pretty profound that a sense of belonging could be the most powerful academic intervention that we have, especially for young people who are experiencing any level of being at the margins. Kids who are farthest from opportunity are the ones who are most desperately in need of feeling like they can be themselves. And when they feel like they can be themselves in your classroom or your school or your office, they have so much more capacity for flourishing. Big sort of insight I had here when I was writing Whole Child, Whole Life is that most of us know the phenomenon of fight or flight, or fight, flight, freeze. I freeze, which is super embarrassing. I always wanted to be a fighter, but I just freeze. There is another phenomenon called tend and befriend. We are wired to be in community with each other. It's what kept our most ancient ancestors alive. Kids need each other, they need people. In the research, it doesn't matter what discipline you're looking at, nothing is as profoundly powerful as the power of healthy, nourishing relationships, especially in the context of culturally affirming community. It will help you learn, it will help you live, it will help you live longer, it will help you be healthier, it will help you be happier, all the good stuff. The next set of practices, guys, we're gonna do in 7.5 minutes, is temporal time. Because when kids come into your lives, you are a part of their timeline. They are bringing with them all of their lived experience and generational imprinting experience. If you are let's go back to 9th grade, a 9th grade teacher, and the student shows up in your classroom, they are bringing the full history of every other teacher they have had before you, every other experience with school, every other experience of an adult that looks like you. And they will respond out of not only their present circumstance, but also their past. You do not need to be a geneticist or a genealogist or a historian to do this practice well. You need to hold an open curiosity and ask good questions to understand that there might be something more in a moment, in a reaction, in a behavior, than what you're seeing and experiencing in real time. The most profound, game-changing piece of research that I have learned in writing Making It and Whole Child, Whole Life is that our kids, because of advances in science and health and technology, should, as an expectation, live to be 100 or longer. So this is not somebody's tutu who lasted, until 103 eating Spam and rice every day. This is every single child with the right resources and opportunities, that's imperative, should, as an expectation, live a 100-year life. And most kids, if you ask them, cannot imagine the future right now. It's like a cloudy veil is blocking it. One of the most crucial things you can do to support the wholeness and well-being of young people is to help them imagine a million futures, a million options. Create opportunities for them to be future forecasters, to be futurists. They are going to need that adaptive skill set, and they are going to need that emotional belief. And when it comes to belief, the final two practices that support the health and wholeness and well-being not only of kids, but also of you, is service and spirituality. The fundamental tasks of growing up are to answer a few important questions. Who am I? Where do I belong? And am I a part of something greater than myself? We are wired for it. It's not a matter of, do I talk about spirituality or religion in my school? It is a matter of our natural wiring to protect us and to enjoy and experience life to the fullest is to feel like you are a part of something bigger. And the problems of the world can be crushing. Allowing young people to have agency and ability to help solve those problems will keep them awake and alive in the world. The important part as we wrap up in the last minute, okay, I went to 8, maybe 8.5, is that thriving is not something you arrive at and stay at. This was a huge, important revolution for me. I used to think kids were surviving and then they were thriving. It was like a walk, sequential. But it's actually much more like an EKG because we're having this human experience and good and bad things are going to happen. Our job as educators, our jobs as people who are collectively caring for children is to create these blue band conditions and keep them in the band. That there is enough opportunity where these practices are in place, that the conditions are right for thriving to happen more often as possible. And for those who are perfectionists like me, the good news is, if you cannot put one of these practices in place, as long as kids are getting it somewhere else and enough of it, they will be okay. Which means if they're not getting enough of it at school or at home or in community, and you have the opportunity to up it, you can create a space where they can thrive and flourish, even when and even if. This is what it looks like when it's working. Kids feel safe and supported. They feel like they can heal and be healthy. They are rooted and connected. They belong. There is novelty. They're learning and growing, and there is a sense of joy and purpose. Because we have to end, I'm not going to go into the depths of what this is, but I will mention that the last chapter in Whole Child, Whole Life that talks about this, we'll end on this slide, also talks about the kupu fern. And so the book starts in Hawaii and it ends in Hawaii. But it's a really powerful metaphor that shows us that no matter the environment, when the conditions are right, kids can grow and they can thrive. And so my hope for you as we leave today is, number one, that you follow me across the hall to the HSTE bookstore, because I'd love to talk to you more and also actually show you the books. There's a discussion guide that's going to be released in January for free. So if you go to wholechildwholelife.com, you can sign up to stay in touch with me. You can get free tips. There are free resources. If you have any financial difficulties, I want to get you a copy of at least this book. I can do that for free. But I want to get these resources into your classrooms and into your schools, because we have to have conversations about the fact that our job is so much more than content and curriculum and compliance. It is the collective care of children who are living in very complex times. And they need us more now than ever before. And I believe we have everything that we need to support them, even if we don't know what comes next. And so what comes next for you is we're done. So thank you so much for being with me.